Allen, Darby, Jacqueline, Martinez. This is the Buyer's Boardroom. Learn the most about who you are today and where you want to be after.
All right, and welcome back to the Buyer's Boardroom. You've got Jacqueline and Allen here today. How's it going?
It's going great, doing good. Looking forward to kind of coming into the fall weather now. Football's back on TV. See a lot of pumpkins
My
around the house
favorite.
now. That's right. So it's a fun time of year for the family. So this is going to be a fun one too.
I know. Yeah, today we're diving into one of the biggest deal breakers in M&A, which I think most people's minds go to like where the numbers fall apart, but it's really about culture, that culture clash sometimes that, it can be overlooked, but things like misaligned values and unclear decision making and sometimes the integration can feel like chaos instead of strategy.
Yeah,
So it'll be fun to get into today.
it's interesting because, and we've said this many, many times on our podcast and things we write about, if you ask the buyer, if you ask the seller, what is the most important thing you've got to get right in the transaction? I would say 9 times out of 10, if not 10 out of 10, they're going to say something like, we've got to get the cultural fit right. So
Totally.
clearly the buyer and the seller are identifying this thing called cultural fit as the thing that they must focus on in terms of vetting who's a good fit for both sides. The weird thing about it is we very rarely ever have anyone even attempt to describe what they mean when they say cultural fit. And
they all mean something very different.
It is. It's very true. And so today we're going to try to unpack this kind of mythical thing out there called cultural fit, what it means, what it doesn't mean, and then how to even attempt to vet whether you are a cultural fit for the buyer, and from the buyer's perspective, whether the seller is a cultural fit for their team. So hopefully it kind of brings a little bit of pragmatism or practicality to this thing that people talk a lot about, but I just have never seen a lot of really good concrete things to sink your teeth into. And because of that, what it boils down to is this sort of subjective gut feel, regarding this thing called cultural fit. And in my opinion, while, your gut and your emotion and things like that are important, it shouldn't probably be the things that lead the kind of the decision-making metrics in terms of who could be a fit for your partner. So.
Yeah, no, I love, so like for the sellers listening, we'll arm you with various questions to ask a buyer so that you can really get to the root of what's their ideal cultural fit. And, because ultimately these deals work when they're, it has to make sense for your clients, for your people, for your legacy, and that makes a successful deal. So being able to walk away with clear questions to ask, I think that will be great. We also have our good friend Amy DeTolla on today too. So she is the founder of Aureus Advantage, which is a wealth transformation consortium dedicated to empowering wealth firms to thrive through M&A, integration, and platform transformation.
Right.
But she has a long history of working on acquisitions. She worked on over 50 deals integrating at Focus Financial. And then she was also the chief experience officer at Connectus Wealth Advisors, which is another Focus Financial firm. So super thankful to have her on, and she's going to give a lot of insights on the integration side of things as well.
Great. Well, anything interesting happened this week? Any funny story or interesting anecdote you care to share?
Yeah, there's always good stuff. Let's see. I'm working on a little bit recently. I think we're kind of through it now, but an advisor that had, signed the LOI. So we're working through integration and, all of these cultural aspects. It's kind of a live thing playing out right now. And, I think just as you go through each vendor and what would be the transition plan for each one, there's just a lot of differences in the vendors that are being used today versus what will be used at the buyer's firm. And I think overall, like the tone of the questions related to all the changes have been kind of questioning it and kind of almost insinuating that it's going to be a step backwards.
Mm-hmm.
And, and some things, and there were a lot of differences. So it's a lot to piece together. But the buyer was really starting to take that as, are we going to be the right fit here? And, just a lot of like wondering, is this person open to change? You say
Yeah.
that you want to centralize more efforts, you want to do things differently. But as we're getting into the details of it, there's a lot of hesitation. And, overall, I think it was all rooted in just the fear of change. And, as advisors are thinking about going to clients and making the change, that it's all becoming very real. And so it was driven by that fear.
Mm-hmm.
But that all of that hesitation was really being received as kind of looking down on what the buyer had built. And obviously that was not received well. So, I think we got through it, but we kind of had to take it step by step and, and kind of unearth, okay, do we really feel like this is a step backwards, or is it just different?
Just
We need
different.
to think
Yeah.
differently about it.
Well, we're touching on another topic, and this is actually a situation that does sort of dovetail into vetting cultural fit. But you look at like where deals fall apart, and we did a episode recently, like 10 things that make your baby ugly, and I think the number one, the number one thing was a lack of humility, just being a change resistor. And this sort of, I think is what you're speaking to. And it's, it can be summarized in just your general attitude. There are going to be a number of things that change when you do any transaction. Now, obviously you'd like that degree of change to be as minimal as possible, but that's often not the case. And so when you're going through this, and this is the post LOI workflows, which we've also shared, this is the most probably unfun part of the journey. Up until this point, everything has sort of been kumbaya, and you're getting to meet everyone. You're dating. Now, you're getting married, and we're getting into the weeds of the stuff that's not as fun. And this is where emotions can tend to get high. You see the boogeyman where it doesn't exist, perhaps. And so if you have a struggle individually with change, it's likely going to come out here. And so you really have to, as a seller, take your pride and put it on the shelf a little bit, and just be willing to say, look, they're asking me to adopt new systems, new technology, perhaps new processes. I might not understand them all at this point in time. Hopefully the buyer can give evidence or rationale why they're asking to be changed. But, if you come into it with an indignant, like that doesn't make sense, or that's my way is better than your way, that's okay once or twice. But when it starts to become a pattern in everything the buyer is asking you to do, it can certainly set off warning alarms in the buyer's mind. Is, oh my God, we haven't even partnered with this firm yet. They're already bucking everything we're asking them to do. What's life going to be like once we're actually married? And so it's something that, again, it doesn't mean you're not proud of what you've done or the way you operate, but you just have to know things are going to change, and it's okay. And just as long as the buyer can give an articulate, rational reason of what they're asking you to do, I would say be willing to go along with it. Give it a try. You may be pleasantly surprised that it actually does work better than what you did before. And give the buyer the opportunity to demonstrate why what they're asking you to do makes sense. And it may take some time, but even if you did have questions about what they're asking you to do, change, or adopt, the way you handle it is critical. We've seen, not in just instance, but in many deals in our past, where, outright, hostility came forth from the seller, and, making snap comments or rude comments. And keep in mind, they're likely the people that you're dealing with during this post-LOI process. It's not the C-suite, it's not the corporate development teams. These are employees of the buyer that you're actually likely going to work with, going forward. These are your teammates. And if you are being rude to them because of the things they're being asked to do with you, that's often like a no-fly zone. And we've seen deals, fall apart from the buyer just pulling the plug and saying, like, we're not going to put up with it. So
absolutely.
Interesting.
Yeah. I guess like the positive version of that too, sometimes I will see when buyers, they demonstrate, okay, look, we use a certain technology for this, and maybe they really are already thinking about pivoting to a different vendor of a similar, function, and they see that the seller is using it and loves it and it is an upgrade from what they're doing, that there can be opportunities to like make that switch. It does happen, so it's like definitely don't be shy about how you're doing things today, but like developing that us mindset or we mindset of, we together as shareholders of this firm together in the coming months want to have the best solution. And is it the right time for the whole firm to convert to that or not? And that can be an open dialogue.
So, when you're thinking about getting to the point where you can actually measure culture, it means you have to spend time with someone. And so I think a preliminary question before you start to either identify your cultural fit or who should you be talking to get to that point of identification, it's who should you be talking to in the first place. And to get to that list, we think the better approach is to focus on measuring compatibility between two parties. Okay. So you can think about culture is subjective and needs time to be able to vet. Compatibility is objective, and I think you can quickly measure that. And so what do I mean by compatibility? It's things that are easy to identify between a buyer and a seller in wealth management to see if your businesses are the same, to see it are similar, to see if you have a similar worldview on what the advisor's role is to the client, things like your investment philosophy, your client experience, all the way down to granular things like, do we share the same fee model? Do we share the same custodians? Do we have a similar technology stack? All of these things are objectively measurable. You can ask the question and determine if it's a fit based on a pretty large set of objectively measurable data points. And so, and including your deal needs and objectives, so it's like if there were, and I'm just making this up, say there were 50 points of compatibility that you could objectively measure first, I think that is a much better starting point than diving in immediately trying to determine if you like someone. For the obvious reason, you could get into phase with a buyer as a seller, let's say, and very early conclude, I love these people. Like, these are our kind of folks. And you have a meeting or two with their corporate development team, or maybe take on a meeting with their CEO. You haven't really got to unpack all of these objectively measurable data points, but yet you really are vibing with them and see it as a great cultural fit. Well, lo and behold, once you start to get to that point of compatibility, you recognize things like, oh, we don't share the same fee model. Oh, we don't have a similar investment philosophy. Oh, I wanted all cash in my transaction. This buyer requires that I roll 30% in equity. So it's like all of these things that, even though you happen to like that group from this cultural perspective or this experiential perspective, come to find out you're not compatible at all.
Right.
And so to me, where people try to go headlong into the most difficult thing to measure, which is the subjective experiential thing being culture, the proper thing to start with, to me, is compatibility. Let's first identify if we're compatible, identify those firms, and then, which is going to be a much smaller list, by the way, now, and invite a very small or smaller group of those highly compatible firms to a process where you can actually spend time together. So starting with compatibility, recognizing that that's objectively measurable, to me, is a much better place than trying to just dive into this experience, the subjective thing. That's where a lot of mistakes can be made as well.
Right. It makes me wonder, what do you think matters more, the compatibility, alignment points, or the culture? Are they kind of equally weighted, but maybe do one versus the other? Yeah.
I actually, like, you can be compatible with someone and it be a total mismatch culturally. You don't like them. They don't share your similar, it could be a number of things. It could be things like political affiliation. It could be religious affiliations. It could be just, you just don't like them. They're assholes, or like all these things that you could say. So like, I would definitely think culture is probably like slightly ahead of compatibility in terms of importance or your happiness. but it would make zero sense to try to vet culture unless you knew they were compatible. So it's like compatibility is like the gateway to trying to vet culture.
Mhm.
I don't think you can have one without the other.
Without the other.
So it's not that one is necessarily more important. It's just a total waste of time to try to vet culture if you haven't vetted compatibility first.
Mhm.
Yeah,
it's kind of like getting beyond that surface level answers on things and like the broader vision and kind of drilling down to the next level to make sure you're hitting on the client worldview, like you're saying, the investments worldview, make sure those things and, vendors and just the outlook on the vision of the business, like all of those things are aligned, and deal structure, of course, that they're offering what you're actually looking for, but it all matters, definitely.
Yeah. Well, also if you think about like what is, because we talk to sellers all the time and they will tell us about their interactions with buyer XYZ and how favorable it was or how unfavorable it was.
Mhm.
It's usually like two extremes. And they will use it like in that experience they had in the context of culture. And it's always been interesting to me. It's like, who did you talk to on that buyer's team? Well, I talked to their head of corporate development. Okay. Anyone else? No, it was just, that's who they had me talk with. I talked to their CEO. Anyone else? Like, it's like, no. And so like your universe of like interaction is really a very limited amount of interaction with one specific person on their team. And they're using that to sort of extrapolate onto the whole firm what their culture is going to be like. And the reality is like, if your point of contact with any specific buyer was like an hour and a half meeting with their CEO,
Mm-hmm.
while that is indicative, it could be a data point in your attempt to measure the subjective cultural experience. That's not even the person you're going to be working with,
Mm-hmm.
After the transaction. Frankly, in some of the larger national firms, if you talk to the CEO once a year, that's probably
a lot. Yeah.
A lot. So it's like, for you to even make an accurate experiential decision, you have to spend significant time with multiple people throughout their organization to get a deep and broad reflection of what their culture is like. And so I would want to ask the question, like, if you think you've come to a conclusion on cultural fit, I would really ask, like, okay, who have you talked to and how much time have you spent? Because those two things are very, very important. Like my wife, when she first started dating me, I think after like the fourth or fifth date, she was ready to break up.
I could see that.
You can understand, but like, no, but she had to spend more time with me. It just took a lot of time to get to that point where she just fell head over heels, but just that first few interactions.
You're an acquired taste. Yes.
That's right.
Yeah. But I love that. Okay.
So,
well, maybe we're getting into the weeds then of separating out these, what can happen on those early intro calls, kind of subjective value statements or personality connections. Of course, we want to have connections. And if you're working with the M&A team or the CEO, like on those early calls, then that is important to create that bond early on. And those are cultural gatekeepers of the firm. But in the next follow-on calls where you're talking with department heads or maybe partners that were in your shoes at 1, 2, 3 years ago and what their experience has been like, I think, like what are some questions then that we could get in, that sellers could get into that would peel that onion a bit more and, maybe learn how these alignment points have changed over time. You speak with a partner that just transacted versus one 3 to 5 years ago. Those things could have evolved over time too. And so understanding how decisions are made and that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What I don't want people, a lot of times when you ask, like, what do you mean by culture? They're going to start going to like their value statements or their mission statements,
Mm-hmm.
which are sort of like these are subjective statements. I would want to know how those mission or value statements show up in their behaviors.
Mhm.
And so that would be maybe a good question to start with. If you're like, go to their website, or, if you ask the CEO, what are your core values or mission statement? As soon as they say that, ask them, well, how do you actually affect those things in your daily routine, for all your team? So let's first start, Jacqueline, with, you sort of touched on it there, but like, who and how many people should you at a minimum talk to get these cultural type of questions asked and answered? So, and again, we're starting with the framework that we're only talking to potential buyers who have been deemed a very high fit
Mhm.
regarding objectively measurable points of compatibility. That's at least the way we do it at Aureus. We don't, as you know, we don't run auctions, so we're just not throwing mud against the wall and seeing who wants to get in the process. We curate the list of buyers based purely on compatibility to run a small process where we open up the window to spend time. So here would be my list of people at a minimum that they would want to talk to in the organization. Certainly the CEO, that's the leader of the organization. They're supposed to set the tone and overall direction for the firm. So I'd start there. I would also, you've probably already had multiple points of interactions with the corporate development team. So those are two foundational people. But frankly, those people are, and I don't mean this negatively, but they are the chief salespersons of the firm.
Mhm.
And so everything that they're going to say, they're motivated to get transactions done with culturally aligned people, but they tend to not be in the weeds as much. So you want to go beyond those departments and start speaking to the people who actually do the work
Mhm.
inside the firm. Okay, so that would be all of the department heads, to your point. So head of operations, head of compliance, head of marketing, head of planning, head of practice management, maybe head of technology. So all of these leaders of the respective, work doing components of the organization, and they're going to present to you who they are and how they help you and what their role is in the firm. But then it's a two-way you get to ask them questions.
Mhm.
And so you want to have an idea of who you're going to be speaking with to try to tease out these cultural experiential things. And then after those department heads are done, we like to finish with speaking to your point, sellers who have been in their shoes at one point. Now they're on this buyer's team. And I like what you said, maybe do some that have been there for a shorter period of time, some that have been there for a longer period of time. So you get to see how culture maybe have changed over time based on their experience.
Mhm.
So you get that whole group of people, the executive suite, corporate development, a number of department heads, and then partners. So if you look at that, that's probably going to be somewhere between, call it 7 to 10 points of contact that you have with the broad representatives of the firm, not just the CEO and the people who are doing acquisitions, but all the people who are in the weeds every day doing the work. That will get you close to a pretty accurate representation. And then before we get into the actual questions, I would look for consistency
Mhm.
amongst the responses. If you talk to the CEO and they're saying one thing, and you talk to the head of marketing and they're saying something entirely different,
Yeah.
that could be an indication that
Red flag.
everyone's not on the same.
Yeah.
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 Right.
That's good.
Okay. So let's maybe give them some questions, like maybe like talk about values in action. Like what would be a good question? Whatever they said their values are, how would you
Yeah.
try to get it
I
that
always
way?
love share an example of how that showed up. One of the Alaris core values is transparent communication. Say what needs to be said, but like regardless of, the impact, and how does that show up, and I can launch into many examples where we have tough conversations every day, and it's done with care, but it is, it moves the firm forward. And so asking about examples like that, and just
Like
really
what
how it's
behaviors
lived.
specifically get
Yeah.
rewarded? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell me about example that you're like in your case in the Alaris values mission statement
Mhm.
is radical transparency. regardless of the outcome.
Regardless
right?
of the outcome.
And so how does that show up? You would be asking us, okay, give me an example of how you delivered radical transparency in regardless of the impact, and let's hear their answer to that.
Right.
So I think that's a great question is, what behaviors get rewarded, and give me examples of how those things kind of showed up in the daily life of your team. So that's a great question, I think. Another one I think you should probably ask really quickly is on integration, because that's the first thing you're going to do after you sign your definitive agreements, And so in the integration, how they onboard you, how they equip you and train you to be successful in their world is an area you would want to explore. What's a good question you would think to ask them about their integration philosophy and implementation?
For that, there's so much that changes, right? And it varies firm to firm. So you take like the people aspect, for example, and like, will reporting lines change after the close? How will their compensation packages evolve after the close? And then things like technology, what will get cut over immediately? It's usually the compliance-based things, email archiving, that sort of thing. But a lot of times firms are fully converting like CRM data, and they want to take over billing as of that calendar quarter right after the close as well. And, so it's there's not like a right or wrong answer per se, but just understanding, okay, how will this really go from how we're set up today to the ideal setup on the buyer side, and how long and what elements of this are flexible, what would be a priority for you to move over quickly versus that we can plan for over time, maybe as a lot of times folks are locked into contracts for an extended period of time. And so the questions become, okay, how long are we running in parallel? Who pays for the costs? There's a lot of like cost related beyond the change management of, everyone using a new system. It's also who pays for what, and just having clear expectations.
Yeah, all these integration questions I think are very telling as to what operating is going to look like in their world. For example, firms that would require immediate change and integration onto their systems may be a little more rigid in terms of adoption of things, whereas firms that, like to your point, run side by side for a period of time may be a little bit more flexible in those areas. So that's very revealing. I think a great question on integration would be, what in their words, what does a successful integration look like? How do you measure it? How will we know when we were integrated successfully?
Right.
And hear their feedback on it, and see how that jives with what your expectations and willingness to adopt change would be. That's a good one. Another one that I think is how do you handle this aspect of change management? Like which areas do you move more quickly to standardize versus which things that you leave alone? Particularly like in the area of the client experience, and this, autonomy is a big aspect of measuring culture. Every seller is an entrepreneur. They're going to be joining a buyer's team where, some of the decisions they were tasked with executing on before are removed from their plate. And so I would want to know which areas of decision making do I retain post acquisition versus the ones that I no longer have to make, or you will no longer let me make. So that could be things like the client experience. I have a certain way of talking to clients about what I do, maybe steps in my process on onboarding and delivering service to clients. Is that going to change? So tell me about how what I'm doing today regarding my client experience will look like in your world. How is it going to be different? Do you just leave me alone in that regard? Am I going to have to adopt new technology in delivering my client experience? Those are very important. Regarding my staff, like who manages my staff? If I have an employee that wants to take a month off, do I make that decision, or do I have to go up the food chain to get permission for my team member? It's all those things in autonomy, decision making of what I keep doing versus the things that get removed from me. And to get to the punchline on this point, a lot of the things that they're going to take off your plate, you're going to be perfectly thrilled with. You just want to make sure that the stuff that they do take off your plate, you're comfortable with. So if for example, one of the big bugaboos is like investment management. Do I keep managing money the way that I am doing today, or are you going to require me to divest that to a central team? That's a big cultural difference.
Sure.
So that's, I think, just asking questions about change. What changes, what doesn't change, what decisions do I keep versus what decisions do I leave with you?
Mm-hmm.
I think a good question about culture, certainly regarding the staffing, is like, how do you make acquired employees feel a part of the new organization?
Mm-hmm. Right.
What practically happens to my team? Who do they report to? What mechanisms do you have in place to communicate to the team? What career pathing opportunities exist for the team?
Mm-hmm.
What mentoring or training programs do you have for the team?
Right.
And get a sense, because a lot of the benefit, I think, in partnering with a larger firm is they have all of these, call them Gen 2 mentorship, practice management capabilities.
Right.
And how does that centrally interface with my team locally? To get a all of a sudden your team is, lots changing during this transition. Now there's a whole world of new people. How do you plug my team into that new world? And your team better than anyone. You're going to know, like, kind of, will my team like what's getting ready to happen to them?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good way to culture and asking questions as well.
Yeah. I always love listening for those opportunities way before the deal is closed, where everyone on the team is kind of partnered up with their counterpart, and they have someone early on to ask those types of questions too. So it's not all on the founder who's dealing with so many elements of the transaction to get those level of details for each member of the team, but that they're opening up opportunities for everyone to connect with someone on the buyer side, and that it's like very specific ways. And major green flag for me is when the buyer's requiring, okay, we want to come in and we want to meet with each person and have those introductions, not all driven by the seller wanting to.
I think regarding this integration question, which is really leading into a whole bevy of other questions regarding these related topics, but is to ask the buyer, tell me about an integration that has gone wrong or badly, maybe not wrong is not the right word, but just and maybe share the things that you perceive as the buyer that drove those points of friction. And then a follow-up question would be, how did you resolve those conflicts? And if you don't mind sharing, like, what was the outcome of those resolutions? Like, this, listening to them articulate, well, one, they should all have a story of an integration gone badly. Like,
right.
Anyone who says,
You're never smooth.
Integration is a line.
Yeah.
Right. So tell us about that. What was the key things about that you feel made it go poorly, and how did you resolve it? Like, let's talk me through the problem resolution. That's a great indicator of how these people think about you as a partner on their organization, and their need to treat you as a peer and work collaboratively through challenges, because there's going to be challenges.
Right.
And you want to hear, like, kind of what their approach to it was and how it ultimately resolved itself. Right. And by the way, these questions that we're giving you could be tailored to any of the three main bodies of people we told you to speak with: the C-suite and corporate development team, the department heads, and the partners. You could ask them. I think a great question to ask a partner is, would you do it again?
Yes.
It's just like, if you know everything you know today after 2-3 years of being on the team, remove the money from the equation. Would you do it on the team? Remove the money from the equation. Would you, and have the partner talk? You'll find that they are very candid with you, because frankly, they have to look you in the eye if you join them. And other than they're a shareholder in the firm, they really don't have any skin in the game in getting you to transact with this specific firm. So they're going to tell you what life is like. Right. So that's a good one to ask a partner.
I love that one.
Maybe let's talk about how they manage people. How do you evaluate my employees, my team? How do you evaluate their performance post the deal? And they should be giving you a series of maybe KPIs or things that they're tracking and looking for. If it's all about profitability and, like money oriented things versus their experience, their happiness and their satisfaction, that could maybe be indicative of a specific type of culture over another.
That's true. Like that.
Yeah. Any other questions that you would say come to mind just in terms of getting at culture?
I think, and this I think is a great one for really all levels, but like really understanding who the decision makers are after the close and for what topics. I feel like that's the tricky thing in any new role, is getting to know how you get things done in the new world. And so listening for a lot of transparency around, okay, if it's decisions related to this, it's this, and maybe are there opportunities to be on advisory board where, advisors of the firm are participating that, and, and bringing up issues to the firm's leadership team. Is it things like that? I love hearing things like that. Or, are you hearing more of, we can figure that out later, or it's very centralized and everything goes to headquarters and it's like, what does that even mean? And, who's really behind it? So I think just trying to unpack who makes the decisions is very telling as well.
Yeah, that's a good one. Here's one I think that's very telling of a firm's culture. It's what are the expectations for organic growth post acquisition? Just leave it like an open-ended question. Because we know, every buyer I would say has a culture of growth, but there are degrees of that culture of growth. We know buyers that, man, they are all about organic growth. And they have very high internal expectations for a seller post-acquisition to grow organically. They even have, economic incentives or sometimes punitive things if you don't grow after the transaction. So you would want to make sure that whatever the answer is from the buyer is like, what is your any requirements for post-acquisition growth that you would have of us? How do you evaluate us in light of those post-acquisition growth metrics? And just hear them talk. And you're going to get a sense of what that culture is like. Some buyers are more sales oriented, and I don't think that's a bad thing, but you just have to go into that eyes wide open. I think a good one is like, ask them, what do you believe is the advisor's primary role in serving clients? And let them answer that question and see how well that jives with the way you think. How do you handle investment philosophy differences across the firms you acquire? Many firms have a pretty broad investment platform, which you would want to know if you have multiple offices around the country and one office is doing something entirely different than another. How do you kind of reconcile that both internally and with the regulatory bodies? How do you measure client experience and satisfaction after an acquisition? That's a great question to ask. It just kind of tells you how they think about that. Do they think about measuring client satisfaction and experience?
And employee
probably
satisfaction, right.
Yeah. I think understanding and having alignment over what you see as the role of the advisor and how you measure that, I think is very important. So these are, we'll create like a list of questions that I think are underneath each one of these categories, but you kind of get our point is like I think it's first wise to try and measure compatibility first, identify buyers who you have a high degree of fit on those objectively measurable data points. Therefore, that at least on paper, you're a fit with this specific buyer. There's not going to be any obvious conflicts that would preclude you from moving forward. Then once you identify those buyers, let's spend time with those buyers across those three main bodies of people: executive team and corporate development, department heads, and partners who've transacted with them, and have very specific questions. And I'd like to ask similar questions of all three of those people groups, because we can detect the consistency of their answers and responses. And I think you're going to, if you get the answers to your questions, you're not going to get 100% alignment, but as long as you feel comfortable and you've had the chance to interact with all the personalities, multiple personalities, get a sense of how they treat you, you're much further down the pathway of checking the box that not only are we compatible with this buyer, but we have a very similar culture, or hopefully very strong similarities between the cultures. And then, of course, the economics and all that stuff factor into it as well. But those are some practical things. I can't wait to hear Amy's take on this. She's been involved in so many transactions. She's probably got not only a lot of great stories, but a lot of good wisdom to share as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll jump to that now.
Today, I'm joined by Amy DeTolla, the founder of Aureus Advantage. She has spent her career helping wealth management firms grow and succeed through M&A, integration, and platform transformation. So prior to this role at Focus Financial, she helped lead over 50 acquisitions and co-authored their M&A playbook. Later, as Chief Experience Officer as Connectus Wealth, she launched the firm globally and built the platform that helped it scale to $13 billion in under 3 years. That's incredible. And these days, she's also a venture partner at Thick Adventures, where she focuses on wealth tech. So welcome to the show, Amy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm very excited.
Yeah, definitely. Well, this is great. You've been through, I can't imagine that, 50 acquisitions at Focus and other experience too. So I'm sure you have a ton of knowledge that you're going to share with us today on successful integrations. But before we get to the good ones,
Yes.
maybe as we look back at the failed ones, how often would you say that culture was really the root cause of that?
Well, as we covered, I've spent my very long time career like working with firms, building firms and merging them. And I would say that, integration doesn't necessarily fail, although there's been a couple of breakups that I had to work through. I think you don't always achieve the full potential and the firms really become fragmented. So it's culture is, really by itself is rarely its culture alone, right? It's often failing to align the transition with the vision and the mission and the everyday behaviors of the firm. So strategy, you got to have a good strategy, right? We talked about this. You have to have it planned very well. It's critical. And that's what my team helps firms with, is making sure you have a strategy, your plan, your checklist. You can't wing it. There's way too much at stake to wing it. But I think a lot of times when you talk about culture and culture, things failing because of culture, I think part of that is that really you don't leave enough space to address this change abrasion that surfaces during integration, right? And that change abrasion starts to really kind of like fester a bit. And the thing about culture is it is like a living, breathing thing. It is replicated by your everyday behaviors of the people. And if you don't align on those very tenets and fears and risk of the integration, that's when people kind of start to, fragment into silos. So I would say I haven't seen anything necessarily fail yet, but I'd say is that culture is really kind of the leading indicator of whether you're going to see success on the other side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And sometimes I find too, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about how it's within a buyer's organization, there's different folks that are setting the strategy, and often a very different team that is executing on that. And that's on the buyer side. And, and soon enough, the seller is all part of that. But for a period of time, certainly before close, they're kind of on that outside of it, looking in and trying to be a team player, but there are like real changes to work through. And sometimes I think that like misalignment, like you're saying, of the mission and the integration strategy, like can be a function of just a large team and different folks focused on different things and not great communication with everyone.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I mean, it's just the way things work, right? A lot of times you're going to have your deal people working with, you guys deal with that, right? You're going to have just a tight team but you have to have somebody on your team that is thinking about how this is going to work after we're done, how this is going to work. And so, and involving those people really where I see, and that's kind of as an integration strategist, I can come in a little bit earlier and think with my mind's eye on like thinking how this whole thing is going to be working. And I would say with teams as well, as making sure you're thinking about how you're going to come together and be greater on the other side. And a lot of that is, getting the right people involved at the right time, and again, we talk about culture, but culture is strategy, really. And culture
Right.
is how you really work. And it's not, it's not soft.
Right. Yeah. No, yeah, I was just thinking that like it can be kind of considered the soft things, the feelings and like the vibe and that sort of thing. But in it, I think when people say culture, they may kind of mean some of those things, but it can really be like the hardest part. What do you think is the hardest part about making the cultural fit work in a transition?
Well, I have to laugh. Like, who are they and why do they
Right.
why do they think it? Culture is the hardest stuff. It is not soft at all. Because at the end of the day, I mean, the numbers are the numbers, right?
Mhm.
Like hopefully you've got smart people can figure out and forecast all this stuff. But I think your strategy must be discussed. You've got to make sure you're thinking about how you're going to come together and how everything. But culture is really different. It's identity, emotion, and behavior at scale. So
Mhm.
when two firms are merging, you're it's not just your platforms and chart org charts and that kind of stuff. You're blending together histories and stories and unwritten norms, and all those things are kind of part of the culture. And so that's why it is really difficult to do this. So because culture is it's alive, it has to be
Mhm.
nurtured. And even when you're under these pressures, really, to make it fast and tough decisions have to be made. It's really hard to predict those invisible losses that are going to come up, that rise up with all of us. And this is on both sides of the coin, of the buyer and of the sellers, right? These
Mhm.
invisible losses that come up, which, I call like, these 5 C's of change. But I talk about it is that you're helping people navigate change, and that is change. It comes with control, loss of decision making power, and comfort and clarity, confidence, all of those things. And if you don't acknowledge and address those losses, these shadow cultures, I think, can really
Mhm.
start to form. And it sounds kind of funny because you're like soft, but you have to realize is that hopefully the mergers for life, right? And you do not want to have those shadow cultures, and you don't want to have people starting to disengage. That's when you start to get the us versus them, and everything starts to slow down.
Mhm.
It's really hard to really come back from that. So I think, many leaders underestimate that challenge of
Mhm.
aligning cultures. So,
Mhm.
but it takes, empathy and intention.
Empathy. Yeah, I love that. Intention. And like
Courage.
sometimes I'll see as we approach the closing is like what's surrounding the seller's team is a lot of it's not the strategy folks so much anymore. They may be on to the next deal, and
Yep.
I think that's such a mistake. But when there's a lot of intentionality of continuing to visit and messages are reinforced and like bringing those folks back into the picture, even though it is a very tactical time.
Yes.
Yeah. What do you think
Yeah.
about that?
Well, I mean, this is, you need to have consistency throughout the deal. And this
Hmm.
is why, when you start to bring, and that kind of comes down to the culture of your firm and your communication. And we'll talk a little bit more about communication, but it is really important to have consistent messaging throughout the deal, from, LOI through close and onwards, and realize oftentimes what you thought you were going to do isn't really what happens, right? You have to pivot and you have to change, right? Because
Hmm.
we things are uncovered, or things you didn't know about happen. And so it's really, really important that you have, I would say, consistent messaging throughout the deal. And that part of that is the flexibility of your leadership to understand that as things change, staying true to the culture, your culture and the tenets of those culture is going to keep you probably stronger as you go through the deal. And it sounds a bit like, again, it sounds soft, but it's not soft at all.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I think, so much can be gained from, of just like the humility of saying, I thought we wanted to do something a certain way and for these reasons, but it's not working. And what if we decide together to do this instead? And here's the reasons why, and like involving them in the thought process versus just changing course,
Yes. Communication, like authenticity is the core, right?
Right.
Like sometimes it just like what you thought was going to happen doesn't work out. But if you take time to just acknowledge that this was our intention, that this didn't work out, or we thought this isn't, and what do we think we want to build together, right? As long as you are, honest and you're authentic about the intentions, and you really, really are looking to create a greater thing with the two, and you're going to get through this. People are very forgiving, right? If you are authentic and if you kind of take time to understand. Again, I talk about that change box that people go through, and that really tough time in the middle. But if you're really, really authentic, and again, oftentimes we were talking about, there's the deal people are in the beginning and they're not seeing those red flags that potentially are going to cause problems down the line. And so then you find like all of a sudden the people that are managing the integration have to handle those red flags and have to manage it through integration.
Right. Totally. What would you say are like the top cultural red flags that you look for before the deal closes? Like the ones that you just can't ignore?
Yeah. A couple. So there's no one. There's a couple.
Yeah.
So I think is when the conversation is only about economics, right? Payouts, earnouts, the deal terms, and there's really not a lot of discussion about the team. That to me is a bit of a red flag, or like so-and-so needs to get off the call because we're going to talk about this right now. So there's like that little, that is one of them. But it's just sort of somewhat of human nature. But the other thing is what I call these subtle aggressions or defensive-ness in conversation. You'll just see this, they just subtle aggressions is the best way to see it. You need to pay close attention to their behaviors, right? And their decision-making styles. And when they start to resist, if you want to talk about the vision for the future and how we're going to get there, or the vision for succession and how we're going to get there pre-deal, and there is resistance there, or there's like, or whatever, that like subtle aggressions, that's a red flag, because that, when you're talking the deal, like everybody's best friends, right? Everybody's like, yeah, this is going to be great. So you have to really, really keep your keen eye on and what's not being said. And again, if you have this sort of silence around when you start to talk about the hard things earlier, that's really will manifest itself later on. So they're rarely obvious, but they're critical. And that's one of the reasons is sometimes when you have the person that's managing the deal, that's having all those early conversations, and not somebody that really is going to have to see this thing all the way through and live the deal, to see those aggressions. That's what I would say is like, that's like the one or two things I see when I'm looking at a deal, and those little subtle aggressions I would say are big ones.
Definitely. I know I find like when you get those hints of it, and I'll ask like, oh, what was that reaction? Or, like I'll see something on a call and I'm just like, what am I missing? And a lot of times when you talk about it, it can be about a fear of something that, may or may not be rational, but either way should be talked about and brought up. And, rather than this, like it can be an emotional reaction that can come from the buyer too. I think we're kind of implying the seller, but sometimes there's these reactions where it's like, what was that? What's happening? And just put the fear on the table.
It goes back to those invisible losses, right? Like mergers are hard on the acquiring firm as well, right? Totally. Think about it. you have a firm you've built and your team feels like this is the way and this is the right thing. And then all of a sudden, you're talking about maybe changing the way you do things. And so maybe people start to get resistance to, I don't know what I'm going to be doing in the new world, or how am I going to be able to making all the decisions anymore? And it seems like okay until it actually comes to fruition. So all of us, those trigger points get activated at different times by different situations, so it's super, super hard to predict, but actually having yourself a little bit aware that as those things arise, that it's often like people want to merge because they want it to be successful. Right.
Right.
Like, it's not like you're going into a deal like, hey, this is going to be terrible. Right. Like,
Of course.
everybody wants it to be successful, but it is so very human. And we forget that it is so very human. And, you're merging these two stories together and creating something bigger. And all these things start to pop up, right? That messy middle is a tough time, especially for the acquired firm, where you're not who you were and you're not who you're going to be yet. And so it's a tough time for everybody.
It is.
Yeah.
Well, and then like the opposite of the little outbursts that we'll see is maybe like silence too, right? Where you kind of need to draw it out of people. They're not as comfortable, depending on your level in the organization, may not be comfortable saying what's on your mind, what you're worried about. And usually it's really rooted in worried about something not being like a great outcome for my clients or someone else on my team. Usually it's very people or like client related of the root of why that is, but I'll see that as well.
Yeah, exactly. It all comes back to, I don't want to use the word, but it's a lot of it is just fear and uncomfortableness. Silence to me is scarier than anything because silence kind of creates resistance and resistance creates fragmentation. So silence can be just as dangerous as someone who talks all over you.
Right. Yeah, I much prefer like just the candor of here's all the things I'm thinking about and, doing that with the right person on the team, but just getting it out all on the table. It's the only way to move through the issues. So
yes, there is. Yep, absolutely.
I know. But on the other side of it, like I can sense sometimes, there's so much momentum to try to get to the close. And there's just a lot of pressure to integrate everything quickly. So like, how do you find is the best way to balance the speed, but also respecting the acquired company's way of working, really?
Yep. Speed matters, right? Especially if you're going to need to, you've got external forces, whether that's private equity or whatever it may be, your speed, you don't want to slow down momentum, but with speed without empathy, again, creates that resistance, and resistance creates fragmentation. I personally believe is tackling the hardest issues first, the ones that feel the most emotional, right? Talking about them openly. When I talk to teams about emotions, and the sooner we can get to the other side, the better we'll all be. So, really you need to find a way to honor what's being lost while building the future. And I don't think there are going to be some non-negotiables. There's just things that has to happen, right? Got IT and cyber and teams and salaries and all those things, right? Have to happen. Some have to happen quickly. Maybe you have to get onto their CRM quickly. That's going to happen, right? But if you don't give people grace and space to come along with you, and don't attempt to predict how they're going to react. I mean, sometimes you just need to let them be for a bit. And what I call a limited, reasonable amount of time to move to the next phase. So sometimes you just need to digest this a little bit. What does this mean? What does this mean for us? And then give them a little grace and a little time. So I think, some of these, if you rush too much, you end up creating those us versus them, and yet that sort of stalls your momentum. So you need to have that middle ground of urgency paired with empathy.
I love that. Yeah, that the us versus them is really really bad. And it's so nice, like when you can't avoid it and talk about like, we and why, why getting through this milestone will make things better on the other side, and making sure that there's understanding and taking time to go through it. And I love that.
Yeah.
Do you ever find like leadership teams not seeing eye to eye culturally, and then what do you do? Like, what would be the first step when you're starting to see things like that they're not agreeing?
It's often hard because it depends on, like, a lot of times it's the leaders themselves that are part of the problem, and it's the people that are managing the integration that have to sort of manage all of this, right? With not a lot of power in it. So I believe that, you need to create something. You said it before, new together, right? You have to have misalignment. Usually happens, I would say, is when one side feels a bit steamrolled, right? Maybe their values or their personal identity feel like ignored, and those pressure points that I talked about kind of come up. So it's usually when there is maybe a dominant team, which again, sometimes it's, you got a really big acquirer, right? And vision. And that's that. But if you feel steamrolled, right? Meaning you don't have a voice at all, or you're not being listened to, or you're not given that grace to sort of process this, and I would always tell my teams, like, you've got to go deeper, and you have to understand what people do with what and why, and what's the genesis of it, right? So if they're just like, just start entering your cases into Salesforce, like, what's the big deal, right? Like, and you're not giving them like the why you need to do this, and why this is important, and where they're going, right? So I just think if you take time to understand what they are holding on to, and why, and allow some time to process the change, it's going to help, because it feels very, very, very personal, right? And so when you're not aligning culturally, it is mostly, it feels very, very personal to them. So a lot of times, again, you're the people that have to figure it out, or the people that don't necessarily have as much control. So like for me, it's like the sooner you can kind of address these things, and making sure you're listening to what's causing maybe this cultural clash, the better you're going to get on the other side. And I'd say a lot of times, one of the things I do is I bring people together and ask, what does success look like for you? Like in 1 year, in 3 years, like for you, like, what does it look like? And if you start to understand what success looks like, and ultimately, what do we want our clients and our employees to say about us, right? After this is done, right? Like, will we be shining star, and will we be showing, like that we are a great firm together? If you really talk about that, when you're having this cultural misalignment on like what your clients and your team will ultimately think, you kind of start to take that a little bit person out of the equation, and that clarity becomes sort of the anchor. And then there we kind of start working backwards to structure and behaviors. So I think it's co-creating the future.
I love that. Yeah, sitting down and having that vision session together, in person, even better, just anything to kind of make it a joint vision, and not, this is what we see for you, and, feel like you can't react to that without some negative consequence.
Exactly. And you got to go, you have to revisit it. This is a lot of times I see, it's like you have this one time, and then you're 6 months in, and you're not checking back in, and not really continuing to like co-create, like what's changed. And maybe you don't need to, but oftentimes things will change, and you'll have to have, okay, now, are we still aligned in our future as to what we look like in 135? So I think that a lot of that is just, it's not a one and done thing.
Yep, definitely. I love that us versus them mindset, and that can be at the founder level, but how do you think about preventing it from taking root at the employee level too?
I said it before, is integration is really, really, really hard, because it's usually the people that are in the everyday that actually have to do the work. And there is that in between state, right? Where you no longer are who you were, and you're not what you're supposed to be. And you don't even know necessarily what that is going to be, right? And that's when or you feel you're not being heard, that's when that us versus them really starts to creep in. And so I think the antidote to that is connection and voice. Give employees like forums to contribute, to ask questions, create what I call cross team projects, culture buddies, mentorship pairings, create new rituals that symbolize the one firm. You need to keep your leadership needs to be visible and united. So people often tend to dismiss resistors too quickly, right? Like somebody starts to kind of like become a loud voice and they start to like push them down a little bit. Oftentimes they're coming from a place of ultimately really, really caring, and that resistance, if you dismiss it too early, they can become the biggest advocates for change. But you need to give them a little bit of time. If you silence them, and push them out, they can become active dissenters, right? And they can really make it hard. So I really think that people want to feel heard. And if you don't give them a way to do that, that's when the walls will go up. So connection is really the antidote to us versus them.
Right. And I always encourage, I have a couple of those clients right now where it's, they have a lot of questions. They're very analytical. At the core of it, they just care deeply about everything working out well. And that's really where it's coming from. But sometimes the message can be thrown out because the recipient doesn't like the delivery of it, or, something of how it was said. And, and so like, I try to encourage those folks that do kind of bring that energy to lean in with curiosity. Let's make sure that we fully understand why things are done a certain way, before pushing back on it, or, before like just fully rejecting it and really trying to hang on to something that's legacy just because it's different, like what you're doing could be better, but let's just fully understand what's being proposed. And then weave in, like, have you thought about this? We've done it this way and it's been successful. And sometimes there can be a compromise point when the conversations like handled just more as like partners coming together. What's really the best outcome versus my way or their way, or,
Yeah, I see that. I see that a lot is on both sides, right? Is firms grow into mergers a lot of times, right? There's very few firms that kind of come out the gate and are doing mergers, right? And so the way, what I call these inherited inefficiencies that we all have, because you've been doing something a certain way, it feels like the way. And now someone's telling you to do it this way. And oftentimes it's the acquirer is the one that's doing it. And they may have the way. They may be really good at it, what they're doing. But if you're not taking time this is what I talk about. You need to understand what you're doing with what and why, and what's the genesis, right? Like, why are you doing things a certain way? Then I'll help you translate that. Oh, I see. You do this in this certain way, so you can get this. So this is how this will work in our environment. So it's kind of really taking time to understand that, people really do want to come together. There's just, just sort of this pride. And when you start going through a merger, and I talk about this too, and people are asking you this, you get defensive, like they're judging you. And you have to realize they're not judging you. And maybe it feels it sometimes, but they're really trying to, if they're doing it right, they're trying to understand, and they're trying to help how we're going to get to the other side together. But it just takes a little bit of time and truly listening to that. And when you start to feel those pressure points where people are starting to disengage or turn their cameras off or have curt short answers, you have to realize that those lines are starting to form. Those walls are coming up. Those silos are happening.
Absolutely. And so, like, what do you think people do, and what's maybe a better way to communicate the cultural changes? Like, as maybe the founder level is noticing things that would be different for folks. what do you find is the best way to roll that out to the team so that it has the best chance of being embraced moving forward?
I think it's, the biggest mistake is pretending that the culture clash doesn't exist. In a way is, and we talked about it, silence means buy-in and moving on. So I think a better way is really to be real about the differences. It's okay to clarify these are non-negotiables and this is why. Like we need to do this particular way, right? And then what is flexible? So building trust by showing teams where they can influence outcomes and why they are important to the future of the organization can kind of create that open space for questions and even dissent. But communication is not a one-time event. It's ongoing. It's an ongoing dialogue, and your actions matter as much as your words. And I said this before, people don't expect perfection, but they do expect honesty and consistency. And I think a lot of times is you get this one announcement, right? And that means we're aligned, right? We had an announcement, we had a town hall, we're good.
We had a town hall, we're good. Yeah.
Let's go. Everybody's happy, right? The better way is really kind of two-way communication that gives people that clarity and the voice and consistency.
I love that. What are some other like symbolic actions that can have a really big impact on that cultural integration?
Yeah. You got to have the leaders show up in person, right? More than one time, more than the town hall, right?
Yeah.
Communicating, maybe writing a note or one of the things I really think is great is if you can fix a known pain point early, you send a clear message that I hear you and you are value. And I think another really powerful thing, I guess, signal is weaving values into everyday messaging. Not this slogan, whatever you have, your authenticity is really key. Even when something goes wrong, right? If something goes wrong, own up to it. Say, hey, that was a mistake or that was a bump on our part. And I think is acknowledging, communicating, acknowledging the challenge. Integration is hard, and learning each other's way of working can feel, again, like just a extra step you don't necessarily need to do, but your communication has to be an ongoing thing. And it all goes back to culture. It really does, because you're constantly listening and you're constantly evolving. And so your communication is key, and reminding people we're building something for the future together. And that's really, really key. Those small acts that you do, those acknowledgments, they really can create trust. And to me, trust is the foundation for everything else. And people will forgive your missteps if they feel that you're honest, you're authentic, and they can trust you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Have you ever I'm sure you have, like, had a deal where it really seemed like it was heading for, failure and maybe not making it to a close, but there was a lot of work on the cultural integration and it turned into a success?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Gotta have a million. I would say, yeah. Well, because every deal's different. Every deal is different. Every integration is different. I would say one of the ones I saw very, very early was there was a really strong leader, and and again, sometimes you have to do the deals that you maybe don't want to do, but you just have to do them, and you just have to kind of get through it. And so he made all the decisions for the firm, was the voice of the firm, everything, buck stopped there, can't hire somebody, can't make a decision. And so what I started to see very quickly was that the people below him, his team, they wanted to be involved, right? They wanted to move forward. They wanted to put new things in. They were excited about new technology. They were excited about the future, but he wasn't letting them, because he was losing control. Right. As we were coming in, he was starting to lose control. So in this particular case, we kind of had to sort of silo him out a little bit, right? You're over here, you're working with us. And we brought the teams in, and we aligned the people with the people on the other side, whether it was the technology teams aligning together, the planning people aligning together. We created those cultural buddies, and he was there, but he was less in control of every decision. And let me tell you, it was no party, because it's a little bit like having to let go of your blanket. But but in the end, we made it through. And but I think you see a lot of times it's the founders are sometimes the people that are holding the team back. So you really need to find a way to have a conversation with them, whether they want to hear or not, and really try to bring people along. So I think that was, I would say that was one that rings in my mind a lot, where I saw where it was going and it wasn't good. So
it wasn't good. Yeah. I love that. But yeah, you spot those red flags early and regroup. I love that. Yes.
It's culture in action, right? You have to you've got that's why is when people say, culture is the deal, like culture is really, again, it's people, it comes all really down to people at scale.
Yeah. Needing that time to process it, and not everyone's on the same timeline of that and need more support.
Yeah.
Well, thinking about maybe any folks listening that are approaching their first big integration, what advice would you have for executives in that mindset?
All right. So 1000%, no matter culture, all this, you need to get organized early, right? You really do. You need to have, the process we talked about before. You need to have a strategy. You need to have a process. You need to have your checklists and your teams. You need to be really organized. But you really need to bring in leadership together, and you need to have that clear path forward. And one of the things I would say is, just because you're acquiring doesn't mean you have it all figured out, right? And so I would say is, like, you don't have to be, all knowing, but be 1000% be organized. Get your teams ready. So there's this thought that, your teams are just going to really understand how to do all this stuff, right? You need to train your own teams, how we're going to do this. And it's hard on them, because a lot of times teams have full-time jobs, and they're doing their full-time jobs, and then they have to get pulled into integration. So you need to be very thoughtful about, bringing the teams in and understanding how they're playing and how they're, going to be part of this. And I would say is, you often don't realize is that they're holding not only the workload, but they end up holding the emotional burden, because you moved away. So you got to realize is your teams are like stuck there with all that energy and all that stuff that you have to do. So you need to really kind of, number one, prepare your teams and keep them tied to the vision as to why we're doing this merger, and let them feel supported. Make sure they know that they are supported, and that you'll carry the firm through. And I would say is, compensate them for the extra work, right? That they're going to do this, because it's extra work. So I would say is, get organized, prepare your team, and be clear about continually talking with them and checking in with them throughout the process, and making sure their voice is heard as much as the seller's voice is heard.
That makes sense. That makes sense. You said something at the Future-Proof Leaders event out in Colorado this year, when you were speaking about integrations to the group, and it's just rung in my head since then. Like, every compromise erodes value. So be intentional. There's going to be things that are non-negotiable for you and for both sides, but non-negotiable and more flexible, and being clear on that, and making a partner selection accordingly. It's really impactful.
Compromises it's not about being dogged and saying my way or the highway. And this goes to why mergers, you're coming together to create something greater. So this is on both sides of the coin. If you're a seller, this firm is investing in you. They want this to be successful. So if you're going to ask them to do this bespoke one-off thing that is ultimately going to erode the value of this firm, because they have to do something different, touch something, create something, you're impacting the future and the experience for your clients. So be careful, the better way to do it is, how can we move together? How do we move through this? Instead of creating a compromise, like, let's think about, here's what you want and here's what we want. How can we move together? So be careful, because every compromise is an erosion of value.
Yeah, I love that. Perfect. Well, let's see here. We have covered so much. Any other kind of parting words for our listeners today?
I would say is, it's integration. Mergers are hard on everyone. Number one is be organized, show grace through the process, and realize that you don't have it all figured out. No one does. Every deal changes who you are as a firm. Every deal changes who you are, and sometimes you got to put your head in the space of another person. If you think about their lifetime work as now kind of being molded into something else, it's going to take a little time for this to process. So, show grace.
I love that. Yeah. Assume positive intent. I say that a lot to folks is, you're like, there may be some reactions happening, or maybe it's the silence, or, it's something that feels uncomfortable, but like, until you're shown otherwise, assume that there's positive intent. It's coming from somewhere that is a concern, and that it's workable, and usually you can figure it out with folks. Yeah. And I feel like almost everyone in our industry, they're reasonable, they want to grow the business, they want to do better. It's just part of our wonderful industry, and I think leading with that it can get you through so much.
I agree 1,000%.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Amy, for coming on our show.
Oh, I'm excited.
Love to have you again one day, and I'm sure I'll see you soon. Yeah.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, what an awesome call between you and Amy. Great questions, Jacqueline, too. And I think that her responses were super helpful in terms of helping someone get to that point of, can they say this firm is a potential cultural fit for us? So great job.
Yeah, thank you. I love hearing her take on it, and it's one level deeper. Our phase really kind of ends at the close, so it's interesting to hear how what the pre-work of the integration that starts before the close, how that is really just kind of setting the groundwork for that first 12 to 18 months, and and how much culture matters and getting that right early on.
Yeah.
So I'm glad she could be there.
Yeah. Well, if you do this right, and you start with compatibility, and then you spend adequate time, it's not a perfect recipe, but in the close to 100 acquisitions that we've been involved with, we haven't had a breakup yet. So I think it really gives you a much better chance, if you do it that way, of post-acquisition happiness on both sides. Not that there's not going to be issues, but it's a much more eyes wide open, transparent way of joining a prospective partner. So mailbag. We got any questions for me today?
Yeah, we've had a lot of mail this week. I really liked this one here, though. Okay, hi, Buyers Boardroom. I've been working with a buyer directly, and we are nearing the letter of intent, so things are going fairly well. The trouble I'm having is that I haven't been able to get answers on some questions that I would think would be fairly standard, such as my compensation after the close. So that is interesting. So I think this person's saying, they're not able to have those alignment point questions answered.
Yeah.
By the buyer. Yeah.
Okay. So this is sort of almost like a reverse diligence question. When you'll find as you're going through the acquisition process on the early phases, it's sort of like this two-way street of question and answering. You're trying to get to this point of clarity, but it's on the bigger picture topics, and it's sort of as you near the end of the dialogue, this process of transacting, the questions get more and more detailed and specific, so you sort of move from this like macro to micro questions to get to a point of complete and total clarity, if that is actual or real thing, but as close to total and complete clarity as possible. So this question, she seems to be saying, is compensation. She doesn't know what her compensation is going to be after the close. That's an odd one, because you would think that things like that's a pretty big deal. Like what is my ongoing growth incentives to be. And if she's not getting that answer, which to me would be a red flag, but not necessarily like a showstopper. We do know buyers who, on this specific question, take the position, it's usually like a stated period of time, that we're going to close the transaction. Your compensation is going to be X, as imputed in the valuation itself. And then we're going to freeze your compensation for a period of time post-close, at which point we'll land on an agreed go forward compensation structure. So it's kind of like a trust us or a trust me way of going about that specific topic. And that's a difficult thing to do with a party that you've never been in business with on such a really important topic. The buyers that we've seen, and there's very few of them that take this approach, a couple of things are true about them. One is there's usually a very strong founder leader at the top. So that's making this decision. That's sort of like an anecdotal comment there. But secondly, they've got a really large number of legacy partnerships and transactions that you could fall back on to evaluate or vet. When that point in time did come to be, like say it was 3 years, did they negotiate in good faith with you to create a compensation package that was fair and equitable and good for you? And so if they did have this kind of like trust me model on something significant like compensation, my immediate reaction would be, okay, why do you take that approach, and have them articulate why. And it's usually going to be something like, well, we've never worked together before. This is the buyer's voice. We've never worked together before. We don't know what you're going to want to do in 3 years or what you're good at. You may get here and decide there's opportunities within an organization that you didn't even consider going forward that may not even be associated with an advisor role. Or you may decide you want to go to the beach more, and so we don't think it's right to create a compensation model before we've ever worked together for a period of time. Just know that after working for that period of time, we're going to get to know one another. You're going to tell us what you want to do and what you feel your strengths are. We're going to evaluate that. And as long as we agree with that, at that point, we're going to build a compensation plan for you that makes you happy. Okay. That's not a crazy thought. It's like that to me, I might not agree with it, might not be the way I would do it, but I can't sit here and say that is a bad logical concept. Let's spend time together before we go putting something in writing about that. My next question would be, can I talk to probably 4 or 5 people who are past that point and you had to go through that process with them, so that I can just hear from them what their satisfaction was, how you negotiated with them. And if they said no to that, then I would probably say, yeah, I can't take that risk.
Can't do that.
Right.
Well, for me, it's like, I like let's say that happened, and that has happened. We've seen that play out before. We don't want to close you off from other opportunities at the firm. We don't know how you'll want to spend your time. Okay, that's all well and good. And I like the flexibility. But let's say the baseline is that I just want to continue to be an advisor and work with my, 80 to 100 clients, whatever it might be. What would the comp look like for that path if that were happening today? And can we at least understand that baseline? Okay, cool. Well, thanks everyone for listening to the Buyer's Boardroom. We will see you soon.